Settle in. This is a long one, so let us begin. At 44 years old, Adelaide Vance stood on the porch of the only home she had known for 20 years and watched her husband's brother nail the door shut behind her. Warwick Vance did it calmly, almost kindly, the way a man closes a ledger he has already decided not to argue about. And he told her that under territorial custom, the Vance homestead passed to Vance blood, and she, childless and widowed only 11 days, was not blood enough to keep it. She left with $11.60 knotted into a handkerchief, a mule that did not belong to her, but that no one stopped her from taking, and nothing else in this world. 3 days later, in the dust-blown town of Solace Crossing, Arizona Territory, she spent 4 of those dollars on the one thing nobody else in the county would touch, a rotting old ferryboat called the Faith, stranded high and dry on a riverbed that had not seen real water in 20 years. Folks called her a fool for it. They did not know that sealed inside that ruined hull was a secret that would explain, at long last, why the Faith had been built never to sink, and why its survival would end up saving the very town that was laughing at her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Vance. If you have ever been cast out of a place you built with your own 2 hands, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Adelaide had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised on the banks of that same river, back when it still ran, in a clapboard house that smelled of pine tar and lamp oil, the daughter of a boatwright named Jeremiah Cole, a broad, quiet man who spoke more through his hands and his mouth, and who taught her, from the time she could hold a mallet without dropping it on her own foot, how one remembers water. He used to say that a boat was not a machine, but a promise that the men and women who trusted their lives to it would be carried safely across whatever lay beneath them, and that a boatwright who broke that promise, even once through laziness or greed, did not deserve to call himself one. Adelaide grew up watching him plane cedar ribs by lamplight, watching him press his ear to green timber the way other men pressed a stethoscope to a chest, listening for weakness the way a doctor listens for a faltering heart. She learned to caulk a seam so tight that no green hand could find it. She learned to read the grain of a plank the way her mother read scripture, with the same reverence, the same conviction that something larger than the material itself was speaking through it. And she learned, though it would take her 30 more years to understand why this mattered most of all, that her father never once built a boat exactly like the plans handed to him. He always changed something small, something hidden, something only he would ever know was there. When Adelaide was 19, she married Thomas Vance, a gentle, unambitious man who ran cattle with his older brother Warwick on land some miles upriver from her father's boatyard, and for a long while that marriage was a good and quiet thing. Thomas had never asked her to stop being her father's daughter. On evenings when the work was done, she would sit at the kitchen table repairing harness leather or mending nets with the same unhurried precision her father had drilled into her. And Thomas would watch her hands move and say that he had married a woman who did not know how to do anything halfway, and he meant it as the highest compliment a plain man could give. They never had children, a sorrow they carried together without ever once turning it into blame. And when her father died the year she turned 30, he left her his tools, his notebooks, and a boatyard that the drought had already begun to starve of customers, since the river that fed Solace Crossing had begun, mysteriously and steadily, to shrink. She sold the yard for almost nothing to a man from Prescott and kept the tools in a trunk under her bed, telling herself she would use them again someday, not yet understanding that someday was still 25 years away. The drought that killed her father's business was never, in truth, only a drought. Upriver, a rancher and speculator named Silas Bramwell had built what he called a stock pond, and what everyone downstream quietly understood to be a dam, diverting the Salt Bend River's flow onto his own land under a filed water claim that no one in Solace Crossing had the money or the standing to contest in territorial court. Overnight, it seemed, the ferry that had once carried wagons and drovers and mail twice daily across the river's width found itself carrying nothing at all, because there was less and less river to cross. Businesses that had depended on that crossing withered one by one. The Coles boatyard was simply the first domino, and by the time Adelaide married Thomas, half the original townsfolk of Solace Crossing had already packed their wagons and gone. Bramwell, meanwhile, grew rich, buying up abandoned parcels along the dry riverbed for pennies on the dollar. Always through intermediaries, always with a lawyer's careful distance, until his name on a deed felt less like a neighbor's and more like a shadow that had learned to sign its own signature. Adelaide did not think of any of this on the day Thomas died of a lung fever that came on hard in the space of 9 days and left before the doctor from Yuma could even arrive. She thought only of grief, raw and total, the kind that makes a woman forget to eat or dress her hair. And it was in the middle of that grief, not even 2 weeks deep, that Warwick came to her with the county clerk's ledger of Vance land and explained, gently enough that she almost thanked him for his gentleness, that the homestead had always been recorded jointly to himself and Thomas as brothers, that Thomas's share reverted to him as surviving Vance blood, and that while he wished her well, he could not in good conscience let a woman with no children and no blood claim continue to live on land that was, by every legal word he could show her, entirely his. She asked to see her husband's original will, the one Thomas had spoken of more than once, leaving the house to her outright. Warwick told her it must have been lost in the fever and the burying, and grief being what it is, she did not have the strength that week to ask him twice. She packed what she could carry, which was not much, since Warwick's wife had already begun quietly moving her own linens into the front room before Thomas was cold in the ground. She took her father's trunk of tools because it was the one thing Warwick did not think to claim, being wood and iron and not worth stealing his eyes. And she took the mule because it had wandered loose in the yard and answered to no one. And she rode 3 days south in a Solace crossing with $11.60 and the settled, quiet understanding that at 44, with no husband, no home, no children, and no more family who claimed her, she had reached the very bottom of what a woman's life could hold and still be called a life. Solace Crossing in 1891 was less a town than the memory of one. The main street still had its false-fronted buildings, its dry goods store, its little Methodist chapel with the bell that no longer rang for one of a bell ringer who had moved on, but half the storefront stood empty, their windows silvered with dust, and the river that gave the town its name and its reason for existing ran now as little more than a damp ribbon of gravel a man could walk across without wetting his boot soles. It was there, on the cracked mud flats that had once been the busiest ferry crossing between Yuma and the territorial capital, that Adelaide first saw the faith, and something in her chest went very still and very quiet, the way it always did in her father's boatyard when she stood in front of a hull that had been abandoned to rot. The Faith had been the crossing's main ferry for the better part of 30 years, a broad, flat-bottomed vessel some 60 feet long, built to carry 2 wagons and their teams side by side, with a small pilot's cabin at her stern that had once housed the ferrymen through storms and floods alike. When the river shrank, the Faith had been pulled to the bank one last time, and simply left, first tied, then abandoned when her mooring rotted through, and over 20 years the desert had crept up around her like a slow tide of its own, half burying her hull in blown sand, silvering her planks the color of old bone, filling her deck with tumbleweed and the delicate white bones of animals that had died sheltering beneath her. Children dared each other to climb aboard her at dusk. Old men said she was haunted. The town clerk, a tired, kind widower named Otis Pruitt, had long ago stopped even listing her on the tax rolls, since nobody could imagine what use a boat could possibly be to a town with no river left to float her on. It was Otis who told Adelaide, almost apologetically, that the Faith was hers for $4 if she wanted her, since the county would rather have $4 and one less eyesore on the flats than keep pretending anyone would ever want to buy a stranded ferry in the middle of a desert. Adelaide walked the length of that hull before she answered him, running her palm along planking that her trained fingers recognized immediately as cedar, not pine, cut and set with a precision that made her breath catch, because she had seen joinery like that exactly once before in her own father's boatyard, on hulls that he alone in the territory had ever built that way. She did not tell Otis Pruitt what she suspected. She simply counted out $4 from her handkerchief, folded the receipt into her sleeve, and told him, when he asked what on earth she meant to do with a boat that would never touch water again, that she meant to live in it, since a roof was a roof, and she had learned a long time ago not to be proud about where she laid her head. That first night inside the Faith's ruined cabin, by the gray light coming through a cracked window, Adelaide began, out of old habit more than hope, to do what her father had trained her to do with any hull she did not fully trust. She pressed her palm flat against the walls and floor, moving slow, inch by inch, listening for the difference between solid timber and hollow space, the way another woman might listen for a heartbeat. Most of the cabin rang true and solid beneath her hand, but along the aft wall, low near the floor, behind a warped panel that any ordinary eye would have taken for simple water damage, her palm found a place that answered her knock with a sound just slightly wrong, a note half a tone flatter than the wood around it. An old memory rose in her like water finding its old channel again. Her father used to build like this. A Boatright's private compartment, sealed so seamlessly that only another Boatright's hand would ever think to look for it. It took her the better part of 2 hours with a chisel from her father's own trunk to find the catch. A small wooden peg disguised as a knot in the grain, and when the panel finally gave way with a groan of 20 years' dust, what she found inside was not treasure in any sense she expected. It was a tin document box, rusted at its corners but dry inside, wrapped twice in oilcloth that had held against 2 decades of desert heat exactly as it had been built to do, and beneath the oilcloth, in careful, familiar handwriting that made her hands begin to shake before she had even finished reading the first line, lay a letter that began, "To whoever finds this boat still whole, know that I built her never to sink, and never to be found by the wrong hands. And if you are reading this, then perhaps at last the right ones have come." The letter was signed Jeremiah Cole, her father. Adelaide sat on the floor of that dead ferryboat, in the desert dark, and read her father's letter 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. In it, Jeremiah explained what he had never once told his daughter in life, that in the last years before the river began to fail, he had understood exactly why it was failing. Because a surveyor friend from the Territorial Land Office, sympathetic to the town and disgusted with what he'd been asked to falsify, had shown him the true filed water claim Silas Bramwell held upstream, a claim built on forged signatures and a bribed clerk, diverting water that by original county charter belonged jointly to every landholder along the Salt Bend, not to one rancher's private pond. Jeremiah had also learned that the town's own founding charter, granted decades earlier by territorial authority, guaranteed those shared water rights in a single original document, the only copy of which had mysteriously vanished from the county recorder's office the same season Bramwell filed his claim. Jeremiah suspected, and eventually confirmed through the same sympathetic surveyor, that Bramwell himself had paid to have the original charter stolen and burned, believing that without it, no one downstream could ever legally challenge his diversion. But the surveyor, before Bramwell's men reached him, had made one copy of that founding charter by hand and smuggled it to Jeremiah Cole, trusting a Boatright to hide it better than any bank or courthouse safe, since a Boatright's true skill, as Jeremiah wrote to his daughter across the years, was building things that could survive what they were never supposed to survive. Jeremiah built the false compartment into the Faith's own cabin that same winter, reinforcing the entire hull with an extra course of pitch and cedar so that even if the ferry were someday abandoned, swamped, burned at her waterline, or buried by drifting sand for a generation, the sealed compartment and its contents would remain dry and whole. He wrote that he dared not bring the charter forward himself. Not yet. Not while Bramwell's hired men were watching every road out of the county, and while he had a young daughter and a wife to protect, and that he had always meant to find the right moment, the right ally, the right proof to bring against Bramwell's growing fortune. And that moment, it seemed from the unfinished, aging hand of the letter's final lines, had never come before his own death took the choice from him entirely. Beneath the letter lay the charter itself, its ink faded but its territorial seal still legible, granting the waters of the Salt Bend River as common right to all landholders of Solace Crossing Township, in perpetuity, a document that would, in the right hands, unravel 20 years of Bramwell fortune built on a single act of theft. And beneath that lay one final surprise that made Adelaide press her hand to her mouth in the dark. A small leather purse, heavier than its size suggested, containing 40 double-eagle gold coins, subscription money the original townsfolk had raised. Her father's letter explained, to dig a proper irrigation canal the year before the drought began. Money that had simply disappeared from the town's accounts the same season the charter vanished. Money everyone had assumed was stolen outright and lost forever, but which her father had in truth quietly recovered and hidden alongside the charter, waiting for a day when both could be used together to restore what Bramwell had broken. Adelaide did not sleep that night. She sat instead with the letter in her lap and the desert wind moving through the ferry's broken windows, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like her father's hand on her shoulder, that she had not stumbled onto this hull by accident, or if she had, then accident and Providence had simply agreed for once to wear the same coat. She had been cast out with nothing, and the nothing she had bought with her very last dollars had turned out to be the one thing in the entire territory built specifically never to be worthless. She did not act rashly. She had learned patience from grief and precision from her father, and she understood immediately that a woman alone, new to a shrunken town, holding a 40-year-old document and a purse of gold, could very easily be robbed, dismissed, or worse before she ever reached anyone with the authority to make the charter matter. So for the first several weeks, she said nothing of what she had found. She let the town go on believing she was simply the strange widow living aboard the dead ferry, and she used a portion of the gold, carefully, a coin at a time, to repair the Faith's cabin into a modest, livable home, to buy tools and lumber, to hire, for fair wages, two of the town's idle young men to help her clear the boat's deck of 20 years of sand and bone. She told curious neighbors only that her father had once known the boatwright who built the Faith, and that she felt it was owed some respect in its old age, which was true enough not to be a lie, and false enough to buy her the time she needed. It was Otis Pruitt, decent and sharp-eyed despite his tiredness, who first noticed that Adelaide Vance asked careful questions about the old county charter and about water law and about a surveyor named Whitcomb who had vanished from local memory sometime around 1868. Rather than gossip, Otis quietly pulled what county records remained and confirmed for her, in hushed conversations over his ledger books, that the original township charter had indeed been reported missing from the recorder's office in exactly the year her father's letter named, and that no formal water rights case had ever been successfully brought against the Bramwell claim since, for the simple reason that no one downstream had ever again produced the original document proving common ownership. Otis, whose own family had lost their freight business to the drought, became the first person Adelaide trusted with the full truth, and it was Otis who warned her, with a gravity that made her listen closely, that Silas Bramwell's son, Colonel Augustus Bramwell, had inherited not only his father's land and water claim, but his father's instincts, and that Augustus had recently been meeting, more than once and always quietly, with a rancher from upriver named Warwick Vance. The name struck Adelaide like cold water down her spine. It was, of course, no coincidence. Warwick, having claimed the Vance homestead outright, had spent the past years selling off pieces of it to cover debts he had never told his brother about, debts run up gambling and speculating on land he believed would rise in value the moment the territory finally built a railroad spur through the district, a spur that, Otis explained, Augustus Bramwell was quietly lobbying the territorial government to route directly through Solace Crossing's dry riverbed and the surrounding parcels, provided he could buy up that worthless, waterless land first, cheaply, from desperate owners who had no idea a spur or a restored water claim might ever make it valuable again. Warwick, it turned out, had been feeding Augustus information about which remaining landholders in Solace Crossing were poorest, most desperate, most likely to sell for almost nothing, in exchange for a promised cut of the resale once the railroad came through. The scheme that had broken Adelaide's father's boatyard a generation earlier had simply put on a new coat and come back around, and standing at the center of it, without ever knowing the shape of what he had rebuilt, was the very man who had nailed his own brother's widow out of her home. Adelaide did not confront Warwick. She confronted the county courthouse instead. With Otis Pruitt's careful help, and with a young, ambitious territorial attorney out of Yuma named Miss Louisa Hartwell, one of the very few women in the territory then permitted to argue land claims, and hungry for a case that mattered, Adelaide filed the recovered charter with the Territorial Land Office, along with sworn affidavits establishing its provenance through her father's letter and through Otis's own corroborating county records. She did this not in secret triumph, but with a steadiness that surprised even herself, understanding that the document was never truly hers alone to keep. It belonged, as her father had always intended, to every family still clinging to a home along that dry river. Augustus Bramwell did not take the challenge quietly. He sent his own lawyers to argue that the document was a forgery, that a woman living aboard an abandoned ferryboat with no education in law had no standing to contest 30 years of settled water use. And he sent, more than once, men to the ferry flats after dark to frighten her, men who cut her water barrels and killed 2 of her chickens and left no note, but did not need to, since their meaning was plain enough. Warwick Vance, learning at last whose widow he had actually cast into the desert, rode down himself one evening, not to apologize, but to warn her, in the same calm voice he had used to nail her door shut, that she was making a grave mistake fighting men more powerful than herself, that she would lose everything a second time, and this time have no boat to fall back on. Adelaide listened to him all the way through, standing on the deck of the Faith with the gold-backed charter locked safely in Louisa Hartwell's Yuma office by then, and told him only that she had already lost everything once at his hands and found, in the ruins of it, more than he had ever managed to build with his whole inheritance, and that she would not be moved by a man whose entire fortune, present and future, was borrowed against a lie. The hearing, when it finally came, in the spring of 1892, drew nearly every remaining family of Solace Crossing into the small territorial courthouse in Yuma, farmers and shopkeepers, and the widow of the old ferryman himself, all watching as Louisa Hartwell laid the original charter, Jeremiah Cole's letter, and the surveyor Whitcomb's independently recovered corroborating testimony. For Otis Pruitt had tracked the old man down, alive and elderly, in a mission settlement near Tucson, Willing. At last, to speak the truth, he had carried in silence for a quarter of a century, before a territorial judge who had no patience left, once the full weight of the evidence was laid before him, for Bramwell's lawyers' protests. The judge ruled the Salt Bend River's waters common property of the Solace Crossing Township, exactly as the charter had always intended, ordered Augustus Bramwell's upstream diversion works reduced to allow a fair, shared flow downstream once more, and referred the matter of the charter's original theft to territorial prosecutors, a shadow that would follow the Bramwell name for years afterward. Warwick Vance, exposed in the same proceedings for his role feeding Bramwell information against his own neighbors, and further exposed when Otis Pruitt's records revealed the convenient disappearance of Thomas's original while naming Adelaide's sole heir, found himself facing not prison, for the law was slow and imperfect even then, but something perhaps harder for a proud man to bear: the complete, permanent withdrawal of every neighbor's trust, a debt of shame that followed him to his own grave. Years later, unpaid and unpayable, with the river's flow legally restored and the old subscription gold recovered from her father's hidden compartment, Adelaide did not keep a single coin for herself beyond what she had already spent rebuilding her small home aboard the Faith. She turned the rest over to a town council hastily reformed under Otis Pruitt's steady hand, and stood alongside the very men who had once called her a fool and a strange widow living in a wrecked boat, as they broke ground that autumn on the irrigation canal her father's generation had raised the money for and never lived to build. She donated her own labor and her father's tools freely to any family that needed a hand shoring up a well or repairing a wagon, and slowly, over the following 2 years, Solace Crossing began to green again along its banks, orchards taking root where dust had blown for a generation, children swimming in a river their grandparents had only ever described to them in stories. The Faith herself never sailed again, since there was no longer any ferry crossing left to serve once the town built its first proper bridge with canal project funds. But Adelaide never moved out of her, choosing instead to let the old ferryboat settle permanently at the river's new, restored edge, her hull half in soil and half lapped gently by water for the first time in 20 years. Home at last to the very woman whose father had built her never to sink and never to be found by the wrong hands. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, To a woman of 44 with $11.60 to her name, cast out by a brother who mistook blood for worth and land for love, who spent her very last coins on a ruin nobody else would touch, because somewhere deep in her hand she still remembered what her father had taught her. That value is rarely loud, and worth is rarely obvious. And the things the world calls foolish or broken or finished are very often simply waiting, patient as dry riverbeds, for someone willing to listen closely enough to hear what they were truly built to hold. Adelaide Vance did not save Solace Crossing by seeking a fortune. She saved it by refusing to let a dead man's promise, sealed in cedar and oilcloth and 20 years of silence, go to waste. And in restoring what had been stolen from an entire town, she quietly, without ever meaning to, restored what had been stolen from herself as well. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Adelaide Vance and the ferryboat called Faith. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to be reminded that overlooked things are not always worthless things. Before you go, we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them. Until next time, stay close.